I met Simon at a conference
A couple of years ago?
previous year, yeah. And I was very glad for CSI to be able to facilitate his visit. And so, in that Australian way, we like to pick the brains of anybody who comes here in case there could be some learning for us. But I know one of Simon's observations is we don't need to import everything that doesn't work. Okay. I assure him we're not talking to him for that reason. We just want to know, from his researcher's perspective, what his observations are about what was a big policy initiative in terms of what we understand by the big society. And it's of political relevance, I guess, Simon, because when Philip Blond was out here, he was adamant that our conservatives, who call themselves liberals, were actually looking at implementing some of it here in Australia. So I think a lot of Australians think the term big society just comes from Philip Blond, but I know you have a different view. So where did it all come from and what's it about?
Well, if you go back, I think the first time it's really used is by the Chinese Communist Party in the late 1980s, and they were worried about, they wanted to know how to move away from state socialism and reduce welfare spending. So they set up a small state, big society policy with the aim of reducing welfare spending over time and encouraging civil society organisations to, I suppose, deliver welfare. It was widely seen to have failed, and Philip Blond himself doesn't, or neither does David Cameron, neither of them mention the communist roots of their policy, but there's some striking similarities which are particularly interesting. Now, David Cameron, I suppose, started using the term in 2009 at the Hugo Young lecture, and there he emphasises particularly the big society. Again, it's a counterpose to the small, to the big states. So the idea is that you shrink the state and the big society will perhaps naturally arise. In that lecture and elsewhere, and this is where he has links to Philip Blond, they hark back to a golden tradition of mutualism in the United Kingdom, and this is around the Industrial Revolution, and the idea is that mutuals, cooperatives, voluntary hospitals all arose to meet the needs of welfare among the working poor. Another tradition is Edmund Burke's Little Platoons, and this is perhaps more popular within the Conservative Party, and this is around charities and the notion particularly of middle-aged women, while the husbands are out at work, are rising up to look after the poor, to teach them how to behave properly. So there's these two traditions that have come together under the big society, and then the big society itself has never really been defined, which perhaps makes it easy. Some people describe it as an empty vessel to which you can feed into it what you want. Then the coalition government came to power by default in 2010, and one of their first documents was Building the Big Society, which set out loosely some of their aims around what they do to create the big society in England over the next 5 years. Just one thing, it's an English concept, the big society, so most of it is around the voluntary and community sector, civil society, and departmental responsibility for civil society is in England part of the Office of Civil Society. In Wales and Scotland it's a different policy's been devolved there, so the Office of Civil Society.
We live in a federated country.
We're just getting used to it.
We're accustomed to this demarcation of responsibilities in a non-constructive way.
Yeah. Well, we're getting used to it in a more constructive way, I think. So.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Oh, Wales and Scotland are.
Oh, through devolution.
Yeah, so they've got a lot more say of what they can and can't take in the UK.
So, do you think that the intentions were sincere, or because a lot of the criticism around the big society is it's just a de facto way of cutting back on government spending and responsibility for building community, in essence, and passing it over. So, what do you think? I know you're reasonably cynical.
I'm reasonably cynical, but I actually think they meant what they said. So I think Cameron himself and one wing within the Conservative Party were very much in favour of the big society. I think the centre ground in British politics is the big society is not that different to the third way, and there's a general acceptance that welfare spending's too high, that the welfare state's no longer meeting the needs of the 21st century. So yeah, they were sincere. Then austerity got in the way.
Do you want to talk? Could you talk a little more about that?
Well, I think the United Kingdom, and it is the United Kingdom in this sense, has promised, I suppose, the biggest reduction in the deficit of any country in the Western world. We're going far above what the United States are doing. We're going far above what the Europeans are doing. And when I talk about, I suppose, a big society tradition within the Conservative Party, there's also a market liberal wing which has perhaps more power. Cameron's not necessarily part of that, but he has to appease that. And they have perhaps used the austerity as a reason to really try and drive down public spending. The big society itself, I think Philip Blond, even David Cameron accepts that you can't just stop spending and the big society will arise, that government and civil society need to work together in partnership. But with austerity, there's been spending cuts directed at civil society organisations.
Yes, I keep reading those about how many in CVO constituent organisations are finding it impossible to keep going, and is that on the ground? Is that what's really happening as a result of austerity, or?
No, I think what happens with austerity is some organisations suffer, some organisations do well out of it, and you tend to hear the ones that are suffering shouting. So, yes, the Office of Civil Society had huge budget cuts. What they did with that was, previously the Office of Third Sector under New Labour had funded infrastructure organisations in the United Kingdom supporting the third sector. So the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, Social Enterprise UK, were very heavily funded by government. I suppose the Conservative approach is that you don't necessarily need the infrastructure organisations, that they're not doing any good, but that the money should go directly to the third sector organisations. So they've cut back on infrastructure spending and they've upset the infrastructure organisations in the process.
Okay. Is it possible to run your big society agenda where you rely so heavily on voluntary service with an austerity budget?
I have to be a bit careful. When I say voluntary organisations, I don't mean volunteering.
No.
So I suppose I mean more charities, which may involve paid staff. And I think what's happened, there was initially a lot of ridicule that the government would go along, pull money, libraries would be closed, and the idea that volunteers would step in and run them.
And libraries were closed.
Libraries were closed, and in some areas.
People love their libraries, I noticed.
We're very defensive of the libraries, and we're very defensive of animals, but children can take a running jump. Can you edit this one later, please? But in some areas, people have stepped in to run the libraries, and in some areas, richer areas, it's not done too badly. It's in the more deprived areas where the spending cuts are really biting, and that's where people aren't stepping in to, I suppose, help themselves.
Are you all familiar with the Social Value Bill that's gone through the UK Parliament? Because in a way, it dovetails in a little bit, and it's part of what I think the power or the influence of the market liberals within the Tories. But I'll let Simon's written a paper on this, which I summarised.
So it's perhaps almost the most radical piece of legislation on the third sector social enterprise to emerge in the United Kingdom, and it came about almost by accident. So it's my local MP, Chris White, for Leamington and Warwick. I didn't vote for him, I voted for Labour, but he got in, unfortunately. But he's actually a really nice man. And so his predecessor had won a slot in the private members bill, so he got to put forward a private members bill. Now, most private members bill never become law in the United Kingdom.
Same here, until the realignment.
So he decided he'd have a go at making a name for himself, and with the help of the Social Enterprise Coalition, he devised the Public Services Social Value Bill. And he was clever. He framed it as a way of building the big society, of enabling voluntary sector organisations, social enterprises, etc., to deliver public services on a level playing field, so that they could bring in money from the delivery of public services and strengthen their contribution to the big society. His speech in the House of Commons is absolutely outstanding, and you can download it from Hansard. If anybody wants the link, I can provide it later. And he tapped into, I suppose, one wing of the Conservative Party. He also, incredibly, it's a bill that was pretty much supported by the Labour Party, supported by half the Conservative Party, and attacked from within by market liberals within the Conservative Party as it went through Parliament.
Because the bill says that when you're looking at procurement policies, which you call commissioning policies, this is before it was gutted, you had to give equal weight to purchasing from social enterprises and those that created social value. But I'll let Simon take up the story from there. Imagine that in Australia.
Wow.
Well,
we'll tell you what's happened.
The maiden speech says, you know, we're going to favour voluntary sector organisations and social enterprise in the delivery of public services. Where it actually goes to, and this was going to be a duty for all commissioners of public services. Now, it's heavily watered down as it passed through Parliament. I think anybody would have expected that. But even as it finishes, I suppose there's still a duty to consider whether or not to consider social value, which by itself is quite meaningless, but does offer, I suppose, a signifier that central government is interested in commissioning for social value, and they have set up programmes to encourage local authorities to consider social value when they're commissioning.
It is a huge step, really. It's one of those legitimising things. It's like how carers leave and family leave and parental leave started. You start with the legitimacy in the conversation, and I think over time it takes hold. So while it's watered down significantly and disappointingly, really, because of the internal dissent within the Conservatives.
Yeah, he's got probably more than he would have hoped when he started off, and there's a huge amount of interest in it in the UK at the moment. So in the one sense, commissioners are looking around how to measure social value, and as you probably have over here, there's more ways of measuring social value than there are organisations in the UK. So a lot of consultants have become very interested, because if they can help people measure social value, they can make a lot of money. And a lot of organisations are trying to, I suppose, demonstrate their own social value. Then the private sector are getting particularly interested in how they can show social value. Now, one thing the Social Value Act doesn't do is define social value, which is a bit unfortunate, really, but it does leave it to commissioners to decide what they mean by social value. So we'll find it that in some progressive local authorities, they will define social value quite narrowly, whereas in other local authorities, social value will either be ignored or it will be just about how many people are employed and not whether those people are disadvantaged. But it really does open things up in the UK for commissioners themselves to start commissioning public services, not just on the basis of the lowest price, but more looking at long-term value and joining things up.
So, in the spirit of our whodunit,
who killed the big society?
Who are the suspects in the plot that made the big society probably realise less than it hoped for?
The big society itself was attacked from the left and the right. So from the left, it's partly ridiculed, it's partly we've been doing this for years. And it's partly this is a smokescreen for the cuts. From the right, this is where it gets quite interesting. The market liberals see it as David Cameron's selling out to the Liberal Democrats. They're the other part of the coalition. And the Daily Telegraph, papers like that are particularly hard on the big society, which is quite interesting. Philip Blond, who was over here, has been quite critical of the direction policy's taken, but also he was the subject of some scandal that was going on in the United Kingdom. If you Google Philip Blond sex scandal, you might get some of that. And also, I suppose...
maybe that's where we learned it from the UK. Destroyed the policy by finding the sex scandal of the proponent. Yes.
And then his organisation had severe cash flow crises. But that wasn't the problem, and David Cameron kept relaunching the Big Society. So the Big Society has been launched, some people counted it as the fifth relaunch in 2011, but it was pronounced dead earlier this year for about the 27th time by Sir Stephen Bubb, who's the chair of ACIVO.
Which we don't have in Australia, but it's the Association of Chief Executives of Voluntary Organisations. And Jane and I have always thought we needed one equivalent, haven't we? We got different versions of it here, which haven't
one for each state.
Haven't had the same focus. Anyway,
I suppose
in the UK, it's quite equivalent power to, I don't know, an ACT. It's a player. It's an equal stakeholder in the public discourse.
He's been heavily drawn into the coalition government, and early on he's made a big play about the Big Society, saying we want to get involved in the Big Society. Partners within his sphere of influence have set up coalitions to get involved in bidding for contracts for public services. And then, I suppose, when the early contracts, particularly in the work programme, went out to tender, they weren't being won by third sector organisations, they're being won by the big private sector organisations. And the size of the contract effectively rules out third sector organisations as bidding as prime providers. And I think probably what's finally killed the Big Society is that the third sector organisations, the big people within it, the charity chief executives who were broadly in favour because they could see it could be useful for the sector, when they find out that they're not getting the contracts, then I think they've turned on the Big Society, and now there's no one left to support it. But the Big Society as a label may be dead, but I don't think we've yet reached the stage where the centre ground in the UK is turning away from the idea of voluntary sector and community organisations delivering public services. So it'll be relaunched, and Labour have now pinched the Conservative One Nation slogan, so it's all very confusing.
One Nation sends alarm bells ringing here.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah. So is that what they mean by?
No.
What do they mean by One Nation? No, I mean, do they mean Big Society?
It's pretty much, it's a big society, but we're all in this together, and we're going to return to a golden age of mutuals and charities and voluntary hospitals.
It's such a different terrain from Australia, the place of mutuals and cooperatives, which we've busily demutualised. But the International Year of the Cooperatives, I think, put the place of them a little bit back on the agenda last year. So it's in its death throes, perhaps, or it's being reincarnated if we believe in life after life.
Yeah.
Is it? You think it's reincarnated, or?
I think we're probably nearing the end of people using the Big Society, apart from as a derogatory term. But I think the concept's still around, and it'll be reborn under the next government, perhaps with a different slogan.
Okay, which implies or infers, I suppose, that there are concepts at the core of it which are worth salvaging, and that's what we might talk about as a group, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that overview, Simon. Simon's also done another paper. What's it called? Is the charitable sector being
overwhelmed by the market and the state?
Yes. You might find that interesting too, because we have similar issues in Australia around what some smaller charities think about the bigger charities and their share of contracts, and it's exactly the same elsewhere. But thank you very much. We're going to move over to here and have your questions in a more informal way.
Thanks, Cheryl.
Thank you.